On this episode of Inside the Outcomes, I'm joined by Shirley Ryan Ability Lab Keystone board member Thea Flaum. Thea is president of the Hill Foundation for Families Living with Disabilities and co founder of the foundation's website, facingdisability.com. Thea is deeply connected to Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, serving as an advisory committee member for numerous research projects. I should also mention that Thea is an Emmy Award winning television producer, and her production skills are more than evident in many of the resources featured on facingdisability.com, including the new I Was a Wheelchair Kid podcast, which we will talk about on this episode. Welcome to the podcast, Thea.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So, as I mentioned, you are president of the Hill Foundation for Families Living with Disabilities. Can you tell us a little bit about the mission of the foundation and how it started?
Happy to explain, Sharon. It started really with the situation in our family. We have a daughter who is a person with quadriplegia, C5 quadriplegia, and we know from experience what a really traumatic thing it is when a member of the family has a spinal cord injury. As you know, and as most people who are listening to this probably know, a spinal cord injury is always the result of a trauma, always sudden. So the person and the family is living a life one day, and then the next day, everything has changed. Suddenly, you have someone in the family who is paralyzed. And at this point, although there is some promising research, and there's been promising research for years, basically, the paralysis is, for the most part, permanent. So, how do you deal with that? One day you're living one life, and one day you're living another. For families, it's especially difficult, and it was then, and still is now, because the medical model that we have treats the person who's ill, which of course it should. But there really was then, and we're talking now, no, I don't know, about 2005 when we started talking about this, really nothing to support the families of people living with spinal cord injuries, helping them cope. So our idea was to create a foundation that was specifically designed to help the families of people living with disabilities, as well as disabled people themselves, but most importantly, the families too, because they have a whole set of problems, and we understand those problems because our family has lived them. When we started the foundation, the question was, okay, so what are we going to do? And it seemed like a good time. As I say, this is around 2005 or six. It would be a good idea to create a website that would have resources and that would enable families with who are dealing with spinal cord injuries, an injury that thankfully is relatively rare, to connect in some ways with lived experience of other families going through the same thing. I guess it was just I had for many years been a television producer, and it seemed to me that a good way to do this would be with short video snippets that would answer major questions about spinal cord injury that everybody has, particularly at the beginning. So I then decided to check and see whether or not this was really a good idea. So we started by talking to a number of different people to see, but the main people that we talked to were Henry Betts, Dr. Henry Betts, who had been the head of the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago, who thought that this was a very good idea. And he really urged me to go forward with it. And also, I had lunch with Joanne Smith, who was the president and CEO of the Rehabilitation Institute, and who was someone I barely knew. And we had a wonderful conversation. She was really helpful. And I had planned, first of all, to deal with spinal cord injury and brain injury both. And she said, "Can I give you a bit of advice?" I said, "Of course." She said, "Go with spinal cord injury first." The reason being, with a spinal cord injury, you pretty much know what you have. with a traumatic brain injury, things change over time. You're never really sure. So, in a way, it's an easier way to begin. And she and I became very close friends. 2 years later, when we launched the website, I sent it to her and received from her one of the greatest kinds of support letters I have ever had in my life. And she and I became close friends. And I continued working with her and with the Rehabilitation Institute and with, as it became, the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. So on the website, we developed a list working very carefully with the clinicians at what was then the Rehabilitation Institute to develop a series of questions that we would ask. And there were 49 of them. And we were asking them to the people with spinal cord injuries themselves, but also to their mothers, to their fathers, to their siblings, to their children, to their wives. What was your greatest fear at first? What was the hardest part of rehabilitation? How do you see your future? How do you handle anger? Do you ever feel guilty? There's a whole long list of questions, and they're there on the website. And then we had people, we shot video of people answering those questions, and the rule was it had to be really short. So the questions had to be focused because I think the internet, now especially, but even then, was an impatient medium. Nobody wants to watch for very long. I mean, look at TikTok. And so none of the videos, 90% of them, are less than 1 minute long. However, you have a lot of different people answering the same question. And in addition to the family members and people with spinal cord injuries themselves, we also did interviews where the answers to other questions about their specialties were longer with clinicians, many of them from the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago, but also from other institutions as we moved around the country. But the core of everything we have done and we still do now is our work with what is now the Ability Lab. It's been a wonderful support from the beginning.
What are some of the other resources on the website other than the videos that you mentioned?
Okay, so there are 3,000 videos, if you count about 1,200 of which are specialists, people with various medical specialties answering questions, the kind of questions that come up early after a spinal cord injury. And so their interviews are there and they are a question and answer format. We think that that works well because you can look at the question and then listen to the answer and watch the answer and find out about the things you need to know right away. So there are 1,200 of those and almost 2,000 individuals with spinal cord injuries and members of their families. There's also a resource section. There's also a video series that we did for really for hospitals and for clinicians, rehab specialists to use called Voices of Experience. A very short answer, 10 minutes long, lots of different people talking about how they dealt with their spinal cord injuries initially. We have a set of podcasts, which we just debuted in September, called I Was a Wheelchair Kid, because we discovered there is not a single podcast for a young person, a child really, or a teenager, an adolescent who grew up using a wheelchair. And that is a really different set of life challenges. So we thought it would be a good idea to interview people, now adults, who were injured as children and have them talk about how they navigated their teenage years. And that's been really pretty successful, even though we just launched it. So all of our activities are really, really spinal cord injury based. And let's see, so we have resources on the website. I'm trying to think of, oh, and we also have more than 5,000 people who belong to our private Facebook group, which is only for people with spinal cord injuries and members of their families and clinicians who work with spinal cord injuries. And it's a place where they can connect and someone will raise a problem about what kind of mattress. I'm going to get a new mattress. What would you suggest? All kinds of things. They can trade information and ideas and ask questions, and it's been very successful. It's a very good group because it's hard very often, since, as I mentioned, spinal cord injuries are relatively rare, about 19,000 a year in the United States, which is, as you know, in a country this big, really quite a small number. So that very often people don't have other people that they can connect to talk about their experiences and to share, particularly if they don't live in big cities. So it's useful. This internet, on the internet, we go everywhere, and we've given permission even for foreign countries. Some have been translated into Japanese. Anybody who wants to use our videos, we say fine, no charge. And I think hopefully we've had a very good reception from the clinicians working in spinal cord injury, and I think we're doing okay.
I want to talk a little bit more about the I Was a Wheelchair Kid podcast. It just launched a couple of months ago, and that was produced in partnership with Shirley Ryan Ability Lab.
Right.
You talked a little bit about the aim of the podcast and who it's going to reach. Can you talk maybe a little bit about one of the episodes and, give an example of an episode?
Well, none of the episodes are preachy. All of the episodes each focus on a single person's story of how they grew up using a wheelchair, and they're a personal experience. They're one person's story. We know that storytelling podcasts are the most popular. And so we decided that that's how we would focus. Each tells a story and they're short. The average length is under 20 minutes. Some of them are 15 minutes or 16. There are no lectures, no inspirational stories here, and no recital of suffering in the sense that they would make you want to cry. Everybody knows how bad it is. What they are just stories of people talking about what they did to navigate their lives in a wheelchair when they were faced with the fact that they had to do so. So if it's okay, I'm gonna read you the names because we work hard on. Here are the titles of the first five. There's one called George, Finding Normal, because that's what everybody wants to be, is to find a way to feel normal again. Allison, Losing Friends and Finding New Ones. This is a story about someone who went back to school where she had been living in a boarding school away from home and discovered that her friends, she later felt, realized that they just felt so awkward. Teenage kids feel awkward anyway. And when somebody is suddenly in a wheelchair, it really was painful for her. They turned away, and how she went about finding new ones. It's a good story. Bill, the bully who changed my life. Bill was had a spinal cord injury as a very small child, and he went to school. He was the only person in his school using a wheelchair, and it's how he faced down a bully and the whole story of it. It's a really exciting, good story. And it's not about inspiring other people to face down a bully. It's just saying, this was it. This is what I did. I was scared, and here's how it turns out. Leader of the pack is an interesting story. Because people are all interesting. Eric, who was 14, is one of those kids who was just a leader. He was nearly 6 feet tall at that age. He was on a lot of different teams, and he lived in a really tiny town in the South. Everybody knew him. He had been a leader, and because he'd been a leader, he never stopped being a leader. He was never, we say about him, he was never excluded because he simply wouldn't let that happen. And he continued to be a leader because that's who he was. Annie, Miss Independent, this is someone who is lovely, and she had a spinal stroke. Very pretty, and she just insisted, still does. She's still that as an adult, on being independent and finding her own way herself. She went back to school trick-or-treating as an angel, for example, because she was wearing a halo. Sometimes after a spinal cord injury, people wear, when there's been a spinal surgery, they wear a halo. So she went as an angel. And then we have someone named Molly. And just now we finished with someone whose name is Rebecca with a V, called I Didn't Let Go of My Dream. She was in eighth grade and she was injured in a car accident. and a very determined young person who'd had clear ideas about her life and felt that none of them would be able to be realized anymore. And this is the process of how she discovered that she didn't need to give them up and give up on them. And it worked out well. But it's not an inspiring story. None of them are there to inspire. There are lots of funny incidents in them, and they're all told from the point of view of the child. It's the memories of how it felt as a child, because once you start preaching to kids, they just turn away. And so far, and we're going to do more of them, and they've been very well received. We made the first presentation at the Association of Spinal Cord Injury Professionals in September. And since then, we've also made a presentation at ASIA, the American Spinal Injury Association, and we just did one for the rehabilitation psychologists who, again, if you're working with children, this is just a great thing to let them know about. And like all podcasts, it's available on Apple, on Spotify, on our website, on wherever you get your podcasts.
And those are all available on facingdisability.com. Althea, this has been an interesting conversation. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Sharon. I appreciate this, and I appreciate the stuff that you're doing. And I should mention that Dr. Alan Heineman, who we worked with very closely, is the person who helped us at Shirley Ryan, who has gone to the various different conferences and presented. I was a wheelchair kid along with us, and it's really he and Dr. Chen. It's been just a wonderful partnership, and of course, before that with the great Joanne Smith. So thank you, Sharon. I appreciate the chance to talk about this, and you asked all the right questions. I hope I gave the right answers.
You did. You did. Thank you, Thea.
Thank you.
This has been Inside the Outcomes, a rehabilitation research podcast. This podcast is supported by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. This is your host, Sharon Parmet, signing off.